was asked recently to talk about the future of food, an interesting topic, a very divisive topic and a huge topic. And also, look, I'm a vet, what would I know about the future of food? So I went to the trouble of putting the presentation together, so I'm going to share it with people to share some of my ideas around the future of food. And I came up with this concept of the future of food, a centrist perspective, somebody in the middle. Of course, it's a vet's perspective as well. It could be said maybe even biased because I work in agriculture, but I think of a genuinely open mind to ideas and want to see what the best for the future is. I had to really, I suppose, at the talk kind of think about why would I know anything about the future of food. So I'm a qualified vet. I spent a lot of time in practice in County Wicklow. I've done lots of qualifications around cow signals, dairy herd health. I'll talk about my Nuffield experience as well. Even got a bit of time working in the Farmer's Journal as an agricultural animal health specialist or journalist. And you know, also as a father of 5 children, it gives you a lot of perspective about the future, I would hope to think. I started my veterinary career very much looking at the sick animal and trying to make it healthy. Then I got interested in prevention. I got really interested in nutrition because with animals like humans, you've got to understand nutrition because there's a massive effect on the outcome of health. That interest in nutrition brought me back to forages and crops and how we grow them. And because of some of the issues, lots of the issues that I've seen in grazing animals, particularly on monocultures, it brought me back to soil health and trying to understand, well, what was going wrong there, and a fascination with soil health. That actually began my interest in maybe understanding microbes, but a core principle on the animal health piece was looking at immunity, biology, balance. I got interested in the microbiome as well. That certainly expedited with my current roles with Precision Microbes. But I also wanted to understand human health. What are the factors driving human health, and how do we develop our farming systems in conjunction with our ecosystems and environment? I've always had an interest in people. Probably my biggest interest as a vet, you think it would be animals, but it's probably people and behaviour. Always also interested in kind of welfare and animal health and how those two are combined. My Nuffield was really centred around an animal-centred approach to agriculture, something I leverage off a lot now with training and the work I do. So that's kind of my background and why I think maybe I have perspective on the future of food. It certainly is a fascination to me, and as well, it's looking at all the systems and how they link together. Very, very complex and very divisive. Just a little bit about, I suppose, the last 3 years. Again, I wouldn't consider myself to have a fixed mindset, but an open and a growth mindset, and really kind of, I've been wrong on so many things and changed my perspective from what I've learned. And working with Precision Microbes has been really interesting. Looking at the application of microbes in soils, plants, agriculture, food production, and really understanding as well that about human health, the gut microbiome, what we eat can determine our health, our metabolic health, our immunity. It's been utterly fascinating. And I think I'll be staying in this lane for a long time now. The biological approaches, biome-focused solutions. There's so many answers to so many big questions by this type of approach. Okay, so my biases, I suppose one thing I did do when I was looking at this, and I'm always watching, is kind of food policy international. Does anyone actually know the future of food? I suppose how and why would a vet even know about food? And also, I think food systems are not rocket science. They're much more complex than that. There's ecosystems and systems within the overall food system. I possibly have biases in the work I do now, particularly seeing the role of biological solutions. And you know, I'm sharing the ideas and graphs that I've picked up along the way from watching much smarter people. Data from much smarter people than me will be shared within this presentation. I do also focus on livestock production and the future of food. That's not because of my own bias, but I think, you know, when you work in a sector, particularly when I travel doing my Nuffield, I was looking at livestock production and, you know, are we on the wrong side of history? And I think there's a real role for livestock production and the future of food. And that's maybe it's a bias, but I'm trying to look at it as fairly as I can. So I do admit that I have biases along the biological approaches. Maybe my role in agriculture makes me biased towards it, but I think I'd hope that it's a fairly broad overview without too many biases. Why approach this subject as a centrist? So one observation I've made is that everything is now political. Food, farming is becoming political. We've seen that in the Netherlands. We've parties that are animal welfare rights parties. So there's a real agenda, and I think I'm a lover of politics and history, particularly American politics. I'm a big fan of John F. Kennedy's, and I look at the rise of Trumpism and maybe some of the messaging around politics and how divided that's been. And I feel now that food has also become a political ideology, perhaps. And hopefully, as a centrist, you can see both sides of the argument. That there's common sense in the middle. It's about really not just common sense, but collaboration. When you're faced with great challenges like the food system in particular is, and there's so many different challenges, the need for collaboration and bringing ideas together. One thing that I have learned as well is perfect solutions don't exist. There will always be the need for trade-offs. And what I mean trade-offs is if we value livestock production, there is some challenges around livestock production. If you want to go to a fully plant-based food system, well, there's significant trade-offs required there. And I think it's about meeting in the middle. But for me, a mantra that I use is progress over perfection. Perfection is seldom achieved, but it's about progress and getting better. So that's why I'm approaching this as a centrist, and it'll be kind of center ground ideas throughout the presentation. Again, this is something that I certainly have observed, left and right. Why the center? Well, the center is important because you start to listen, you're open to ideas, and you're seeing the best of probably both worlds, and the answers are often in the middle. And when you've got such division and debate, it becomes the dialogue of the deaf. Nobody's listening. And of course, when you talk about left and right, being very afraid of the extreme views. And I have noticed that food systems have been pulled into the political debates like every subject seems to be. This was, I suppose, Nuffield gave me an international perspective for agriculture. I said it gave me a window to global agriculture. And I also, I suppose, with the Farmers Journal, I got a perspective for national agriculture in Ireland, outside of maybe the veterinary sphere, how agriculture systems work, the cooperative structure, farming, legislation, food production, how important it is to us as a nation, the challenges that are there. But Nuffield was a real eye-opener into international food production challenges, opportunities. My Nuffield was done on a cow-centered approach to modern dairy farming. And from that Nuffield, I've really been able to leverage some of the ideas that I developed within it. And as a vet, and certainly in livestock production, some of the big challenges are around animal welfare, how we farm animals, production sustainability. And it was a really simple idea, and I think it holds true since 2018 when I did my Nuffield, that it is the huge benefits to biological optimization. So understanding what animals' needs are, optimizing within the system for better animal health, welfare, farmer, it's a benefit from production, profitability, and overall for the sustainability of the industry, it's huge. And it's something I've leveraged off and worked with quite a bit. One of the last pictures I took on my Nuffield travels was in an airport on the way home, last trip from America. In the bathroom was this disposable syringe for diabetic insulin syringes, and it really, to me, was kind of a stark end to what was a very exciting global tour. I visited 14 countries around maybe where metabolic health was. That now we are so dependent on food, not dependent, but the consequences of overconsumption. I've always been interested in food and its role in health from a personal perspective, and I think if we look at it, the future of food through the lens of human health, it's hugely valuable, but a stark reminder of where we potentially are globally around human metabolic health and food. So when I was doing my Nuffield, I had a good mentor who said to me, you've got to ask really good questions. So simple questions are often the best. So why do we actually produce food? Another question I had, because I'm so deeply ingrained and believe in livestock production, is, would my grandchildren be proud of what I do as a veterinarian working in livestock? I was on the wrong side of history. I think with Nuffield as well, global perspectives on agriculture, understanding that it's not just about livestock production, looking at developing countries, but developed countries and developing countries, around food production, what food production means to different people and different systems, and the impacts of climate change globally. I always would like to think that I'm a good systems thinker, basically that I try and put the pieces of the jigsaw together to see what the outcomes are. And I remember the first time as a vet I did this was with calf diarrhea case, where I went from moving for the very first time to treating the animals to actually looking at, well, why are the calves getting diarrhea in the first place? Calf scour. And ever since then, I've always tried to look at the systems, the links, I suppose the causation, the root causes of problems, and understanding how each piece fits together. I mentioned as well this idea of progress over perfection. Perfection is seldom never achieved. And I think this is what I've tried to do when I set out to do my Nuffield, and it's been something that's stuck with me since then. And it's about attacking it from the middle. I think we get a lot of our information, and I even do myself, from social media now, and we often see a very angry, vocal minority, and the silent majority is a really important part of the story, and they're often in the middle. So when we look at the future of food, I'm reminded of Stephen Covey's great quote of begin with the end in mind. And that's why I look at, I suppose, food production in the context of human health. So looking at the challenges and looking at the opportunity, food and health, food in our ecosystems, which is a really important conversation, and farming the future. What are some of the real issues that often don't get covered? Maybe there are observations I've made from my travels. Of course, technology that may disrupt significantly, if you look at potentially AI, but technology is only part of the story. Some of the things that won't change are people and behaviors over time. And where we might go with the future of food. And again, it's maybe a bias, and it's a personal opinion. I think we've got to follow trends. And the trends that I think are really interesting are around soil health. Reading about soil health for many years. I love this picture I got off the internet around the house of cards, and I'll explain a bit more about that again. But how soil health is the foundation for basically health on our planet. Water, probably one of the most precious resources we have. And unfortunately, there'll be wars fought over water in the current climate. Looking at regenerative agriculture, the story around that, what does it mean? Is it scalable? Certainly the technology trends, smart farming is really exciting. I've seen that firsthand, been involved in many projects around technology and agriculture, animal health monitoring, diagnostics. So there is certain trends, but we can't be completely reliant on technology to solve all our problems. What's most interesting when you read about human health and food is that in developed countries in particular, there's a reduction of infectious disease, but chronic disease is on the rise. I've been lucky to be involved with Precision Microbes as a consultant on both the plant, just the agricultural, the animal health side, and also being involved in the future of the human health side of the business as well, and looking at gut health and chronic disease. So there's some significant trends, but some of the most observable trends are coming from human health in developed countries, where we're seeing an increase in chronic disease. And that's going to have a huge impact. So if you're going to try to change things for the better, we've got to look at trends and see where there's problems and challenges and how we can address them. If you asked me 10, 12 years ago, what are farmers and what do they do? I would have probably given you a very simplistic answer. We're in the food production business. It's a production business. But I think you go to many talks and listen to people like Professor Paddy Wall and different people, and people talk about, and I think this is really where I see food production, is in the human health business. Start with the end in mind. Why are we producing food? It is for human consumption, to promote and sustain and provide benefits for people. And I think that human health piece is huge in developed countries, and in developing countries it's even a more important question. We now have to produce food also with the view of human health, but also our ecosystems and biodiversity, and it's a great challenge. But it's also why I really think agriculture is the most exciting industry in the world. With all the challenges faced, we have so many significant opportunities. And working in agriculture and food production, all levels of food production, be it horticulture, livestock production, cropping, whatever it might be, it is really, really exciting because we have great challenges, and we need to be innovative and create really, really good solutions. But with the end in mind that we're trying to produce food to improve human health. So it's an important subject. Our food systems is one of the most complex systems we have. As I said, it's not rocket science, it's much more complicated than that. And there is a real realization that we're potentially 3 missed meals away from chaos as a society. I think during COVID, when I queued for milk and bread, couldn't get the toilet roll, but when I queued for milk and bread, there was a real fear around, well, what happens if our food systems fail? And as a father of young children, I think that was a real eye-opener. And I was possibly getting a little bit ideological about food production at the time, and it brought me back to basics, that it's an incredibly important system. Our food system maybe sometimes abuses our most valuable resource, which is our planet. And it has the ability to sustain us, or if we get it wrong, destroy us. So this is why agriculture is the most exciting, maybe terrifying industry in the world right now. And that's what's at stake when we talk about the future of food. So don't take this topic lightly, but it's an incredibly important one. But facts do matter. I read a good book called Factfulness. And there's a great food futurist, which I've taken a lot of his ideas maybe in this presentation, Jack Bobo. And he asked the question, are things bad and getting worse? Or are they good and getting better? And I think as a centrist, very few of us, maybe this is a personal opinion, very few of us would trade places with our grandparents for the lives that we have now. So things have got a lot better. When you look at global trends around child mortality, even land use in relation to efficiency. So we've got some things really right, but we need to get a lot better. And it's about understanding where are we now, taking a really pragmatic view of where we are and where we need to get better. I think I have real issue with the idea of a plant-based future. I think it's become quite ideological, and I think we need to just step back and be a little bit realistic. I mean, there's a real anti-livestock bias, I would say, in the media. You could say that's my own opinion for somebody who's working in that industry, but I try and step back from these things as best I can. And within every food system, the reality is of trade-offs. So there's, no matter what system we go forward with, there is always trade-offs because there's no perfection. But facts do matter. So we have got a lot of things right. I think when you look at food, you've got to look at when things started and when things changed. There's some great talks that I've been at listening to food production and food systems, and I think we can look at early days for food development and how we domesticated livestock, how we got better at cropping. But I think the real food revolution, or the green revolution as it's known, came post World War II, where we were at a time when we look forward and it was projected that global population was going to explode. Total agricultural land available land was limited, so there was a real challenge. And if we go back to post-World War II, there's a very important figure in the Green Revolution. Many will know of him, Norman Borlaug, who was an agronomist who went to Mexico in the late 1940s to work on wheat, breeding wheat and looking at genetics. And that was the start of the Green Revolution, where through plant breeding, followed by the introduction of chemical fertilizers, we were able to produce much more food with the available land we had. And that green revolution, that efficiency around agriculture, at the time was a revolution, because we were faced with huge challenges, and the work of Borlaug, who sweated tirelessly and spent hours finding solutions. When he went to Mexico in the late 40s, they were 30% sufficient for wheat, and when he left in the late 1950s, I think they were totally self-sufficient. So, and that word spread around the world in global agriculture. Again, if we go forward to 2020, we look at global food production, the population increased, and this is a really interesting one, that actually total agricultural land hasn't increased, but efficiency has. And now we have a case, because of the Green Revolution, of a story of abundance in global food production. And that has had, I suppose, unintended consequences. And I think, as a centrist, when I was putting this presentation together in the last couple of weeks, we think about unintended consequences, and this popped into my head. We all know that plastic straws are incredibly bad for the environment, and they were banned in many, many countries. As a centrist, I understood this as a necessary evil, except not a necessary evil is the wrong word, but a necessary move because of the impact of plastic. But as a centrist, I moaned that my McDonald's milkshake was never to be the same again. And while I was putting this presentation together, I read an article on paper straws and their impact on health because of the PFAS chemicals that are in paper straws. So I think banning plastic straws is a good idea, by the way, but I think there's always unintended consequences. I'm also reminded of the story, I was at a conference one time, somebody was talking about the ugly vegetable story. You know, as a society, we like manicured vegetables in our supermarkets, and there was a real move to use all vegetables matter, and the unintended consequences of that was a lot of these vegetables were going to food banks. Particularly, this was a case in America, where food banks suffered because of the policies around making sure that all vegetables were used and sold to supermarkets. So I suppose two maybe examples, obtuse examples of unintended consequences. And that leads me into the unintended consequences of the Green Revolution. What we're seeing is, I suppose, a story of abundance. We produce more food than we need. We know that food waste is a huge challenge. If you go to the shopping or to the supermarket, we have different chocolates, mayonnaises. We've got a variety and selection. Like it's just an incredible abundance. Maybe it's a marketing thing. So what has that story of abundance been on human health? And if we now look at sustainability, we also look at the impact of our planet. We're producing more food than we need. We've got a lot of food waste. That has unintended consequences on the planet. I think the impact on farmers as well. When farmers were asked to react in the late 40s, early 50s, the early part of last century, or middle of last century, agriculture responded. But this efficiency has driven down prices. Main farming is farmers are scaling up and working quite hard. What's the impact on society and consumers? Well, if we have an abundance, there's always going to be challenges. And I think people are, and again to quote Jack Bobo, have never cared more and known less about how food is produced, and actually the complexity of the food system. We're probably at this pivot point now in agriculture as an external observer, where we need to have our next revolution, where the efficiency we've created has been extremely positive in many ways, but it's created some challenges that we now need to react to. And that abundance, on the impact of abundance of food on human health, and the impact particularly on our planet as we go forward. And understanding, and I think this is a really important thing that I observe that's often not talked about, is actually the impact on farmers. There's particularly within the media, can be very negative on farmers. I'm not defending farmers wholesale, but farming as an observer is an incredibly difficult occupation, and producing food's not easy. It's important that we remember that we sustain and have an industry that's exciting, where we retain people who are going to farm and produce food. So again, the future of food, start with the end in mind. Look at human health. Look at our ecosystems and planetary health. The important social, economic and political sustainability. Yes, political sustainability, because I think food has been dragged into the political arena. And then some opinions along the way. Again, I love these graphs looking at metabolic health in developed countries. Again, if you look in the 1950s, if you look at the bell curve and look at metabolic health where it was, with a BMI of 30 set as above that being a challenge. And if we just observe BMI in developed countries over up to the 1980s and up to 2020, we've seen a significant shift in the bell curve and a significant rise in obesity and metabolic health issues. Again, if we look at human health, the trends around human health, we've been very effective at reducing infectious disease through the advent of hygiene, sanitation, antibiotics, vaccinations. We have driven down infectious disease, particularly in developed countries, but we are seeing an overwhelming rise in chronic disease. And that chronic disease prevalence is going to have a massive, massive impact on our health systems, and because of that, the consequences of an overwhelmed health system and a society is huge. So we're seeing a rise in what we call non-communicable chronic disease. Again, if we look at some global nutrition stats, these are from the WHO, UNICEF. Again, there is a significant portion of the world's population that are undernourished. A lot of children affected by undernourishment. 45 million children under 5 years are wasted. 37 million children on the extreme are overweight. And 2.2 billion adults now are overweight or obese. And this is a significant challenge that we need to react to. I think we've always had the issues of hunger and poor food distribution, but now the story of overabundance is going to be a problem we really need to tackle. I think that's on a macro level. If we look at micronutrient level as well, there's a lot of research that I've pulled these slides off the internet again, looking at micronutrients. And again, it reads for stark reading. So it's about reacting to what we see. I love evolutionary medicine. It's an idea I've come across again in trying to think outside the box and reading. Again, part of my field was biological optimization. So really trying from an animal perspective and farmed animals to try and optimize biology and their behaviors in systems for better health, welfare and production outcomes. Again, if we look at evolutionary medicine, this is interesting from a human perspective. I mean, we've seen significant shifts over the last 100 years in human health, but evolutionary, there hasn't been shifts over thousands of years. So what did we do through evolution that was good for us in relation to diet, sleep, exercise, movement, and why modern lifestyle has changed a lot of them. One of the areas that I've become increasingly interested in is the gut microbiome, gut health, because of my role with Precision Microbes. And again, sifting through data across all species, we see this. But if this chart here shows a really interesting study done on the Human Genome Project, or Gut Microbiome Project, where they looked at traditional lifestyle populations, the diversity of the gut microbiome versus developed countries. And we've seen a wider diversity in traditional lifestyle populations, which from an evolutionary medicine point of view would be kind of more where we should be, to looking at the gut microbiomes in developed countries. And we've seen a narrowing and a shift of the microbiome. A lot of people in you call it the microbiome hype cycle would say a lot of chronic disease and chronic disease issues has come from those dietary changes, particularly within the gut microbiome. From the research I've seen, again, across animal species, I think I would tend to agree. I've seen it across all the different species we work with and trial work that we've been doing around the shift in the gut microbiome and the rise of chronic and metabolic and inflammatory disease issues. So I think evolutionary medicine will give us some guides. Again, if we look at the biological principles and understanding, okay, well, this is what humans were evolved to do. This is the shifts and changes that occurred in lifestyle and diet. Maybe we need to shift back and understand these a little bit better. That's my kind of take on evolutionary medicine. So when it comes to diet, it's an incredibly complex subject. There's keto, paleo, vegetarian, vegan, Mediterranean, raw, carnivore, low carb, no sugar, all these diets. And diet is no longer about sustenance and health. It's become an ideology, and you know, there's many reasons for the growth of ideologies. Religion could have been seen as one in the past, and people often like to have something that they believe in. Often maybe says who they are, defines them. So I think that can be a dangerous thing when we look at trying to create policies when diets are ideological. And again, if we look at pure science, so I read a lot about human nutrition. I've always had an interest in animal nutrition, but you know, human nutrition as well. There's nearly a paper and an argument for them all. So I've heard professors, really good professors, talk about the value of keto diets, vegan diets, and all making sound and reasonable arguments. And there's kind of papers now in science to back them all up. I found it really interesting when I was listening to a talk on gut health recently from a real guru in the space who was advocating for a plant-based diet, but also advocating for research they were doing around a synthetic meat alternative food, which from other research I've been doing is full of preservatives, additives, emulsifiers. And I suppose when I look at some of the science, I get sometimes confused that, you know, how, and again, as somebody who reads a lot, I mean, if it's so confusing for me, and I think I have a little understanding of the subject, well, you know, if you don't have an understanding how confusing all these different messaging is. Aside from all of that, there's one glaringly obvious thing within the food and diet systems, or within our food systems around diet. And there's one diet that is bad, and that, particularly in developed countries and now in developing countries, is the one most of us consume, and that is ultra-processed food. I think when we look at some of the alternative diets, they all have a benefit because they're simplified, they tend to be based around whole foods, and they cut out a lot of the crap. And the crap really is around ultra-processed foods. And this is the real, I think when you go and try and put a presentation like this together and look at ultra-processed foods and where we are from a human metabolic health point of view, look at the overabundance, look at the planetary impacts. There's one diet that is maybe the next smoking, maybe the smoking of the 1980s, and that is ultra-processed food. Again, when we look at health, when I was looking at this, reviewing some national health policies or health strategies, and I always tend to go to, maybe from a veterinary perspective, I often went to the Scandinavian countries, I've travelled a good bit, and they often have templates around particularly animal health and human health, but I could find no food policies from a government level that are national health strategies that I could use as a prime example. And when it comes to health, it can be an incredibly, again, divisive subject. And it's about being in the middle. So, you know, there's an argument, or there's maybe on one side that all bodies are beautiful, and on the extreme other side, then there's the Instagram influencer 8-pack, this kind of unattainable level of health somewhere in the middle. And I think it can be, again, a divisive conversation where it becomes a dialogue of the deaf. We've got to admit that poor metabolic health is having huge impacts, and then we can't set unachievable goals around health. I think it's really interesting as well, looking at things like Ozempic, which is a diabetic drug, which was mooted as a solution to our metabolic and obesity crisis. And again, I'm always worried where we look at chemical solutions to the problems, and I think people are moving a little bit away from Ozempic, but some people are actually, some of the talks that I looked at were talking about Ozempic as a national strategy to target metabolic health. I think we need to have a very open conversation about health. It's in the middle, and for me it actually starts at an education level, and I look at all the challenges globally and I wonder why isn't health, food and health, a subject in school? Primary educational subject, because it's going to be such an important subject as we go forward, and it's going to have a huge impact on society. I don't like ultra-processed foods, but I consume them because in a world where we're moving fast, convenience helps. They're tasty, they're addictive, but they are a real challenge. And I think when you look at food systems as well, it's quite apparent that very few companies control a lot of our food production systems. And if we look at markets, and I'm a capitalist, so I believe in capitalism, but if we look at markets and marketing and how we grow market share, it's often by taking what we have and maybe either complicating it a little bit and telling a story around it. But ultra-processed foods are having a huge impact on human health. And this is one of the things I looked at and thought about when I was traveling to Nuffield was, often people were talking about, meat is bad, synthetic biology, lab-grown meat, plant-based alternatives are the solution. All the plant-based solutions I've seen have been ultra-processed. We consume huge amounts of junk food, and I think synthetic biology to me is a real concern around, well, maybe we just need to eat less, but eat more whole foods. But to me as well, when I look at the marketing budgets, the influence that ultra-processed foods have on our societies, the companies that are selling them are quite influential. They sponsor sport, all your TV ads, or I'm a YouTube head now, your ads are all around a lot of ultra-processed food. So I don't know what the structure and strategy is, but I think if I was looking, if I was involved in policy, I would be chasing ultra-processed foods at national policy level to try and curb particularly their influence on younger people and their impact on health. And then that's the story maybe of abundance, but then there's still the frightening reality of hunger and starvation. So if we look at one person every 4 seconds dies of hunger, and that's mostly children. That's a frightening statistic. So I'm 36 minutes into this presentation. That's a lot of people and children that just have died from starvation. So, and I don't think this has been a challenge always around maybe distribution, not supply of food. And I think sometimes in developed countries, we forget about developing countries and agriculture, and we talk about climate change, maybe livestock. And livestock production in certain parts of the world has a huge role to play in alleviating some of these challenges. Particularly, I might talk about, I think I have mentioned him, Alan Savory, and the work of Savory Institute around regenerative agriculture in areas where desertification and climate change are a huge challenge. And you just wonder why policies like this are not being implemented at scale where we can actually really make a difference. Something I suppose in my future career I'd like to be involved in is looking at developing countries and how we can assist with improving agricultural education and food systems and trying to alleviate these frightening statistics. So there is a case, efficiency in agriculture comes at a cost. We have produced an abundance, and we certainly have made food cheap through efficiency. And sometimes I think people forget that when they look at debating food policy, and it's really interesting. I was at a talk recently where the story of local sustainable food. Sometimes local food isn't always sustainable when you look at food miles, because if you look at transport as a part of that chain, if countries can produce food in a more sustainable way, the transport of emissions from transporting that food globally is minuscule. So I think also that we cannot underestimate the benefits as well of having cheap food in some situations, but abundance and cheap food causes problems. We're in a profit-driven market, and as a capitalist I understand that, and I think that's an important driver for innovation, but sometimes it can get completely skewed, and we need to know, particularly when it comes to ultra-processed food, that we need to look at marketing ultra-processed food, and really it has to come with a serious health warning. Again, efficiency in agriculture, the Green Revolution has had an impact on our ecosystems and biodiversity, because we did not increase available land to farm. We increased efficiency within the available land, and that through chemicals in particular, through the farming systems that have evolved to produce this food, has had an impact on our ecosystems. And again, that efficiency story on human health, particularly in developed countries. I think one of our biggest challenges is metabolic health. Again, it can be political, because people say you can't be talking about metabolic health, you're going to make people feel bad. But I think and then some people just will have this very simplistic argument, well, just exercise and eat less. But if you truly understand the nature of ultra processed food, the addictive nature of it, I think that's an oversimplistic argument. I think this is one of my own observations. What about the people who produce the food? And when you go on a practical level and you leave your sustainability conference with academics and people like myself who are farming, when using the pen, not the plough, when you get out onto the ground, the biggest challenge is people, workforce, having people on farms, be it cropping, livestock production, horticulture, to actually produce the food. And the demographics of farmers is quite shocking. And if you look at that, I was at a conference in Germany, again, maybe late at night in the bar you have a discussion about the real issues, but looking at age profiles, succession, people to actually farm, this is something that's seldom talked about. And if you had a sports club where you had a good senior football team or an older, a good senior team, and you had no young structure around youths coming through, well, the impact is huge. Any workforce is the same. If you don't have a pipeline of young, enthusiastic people coming through, seeing a vibrant future around agriculture, that's really important. And I think we have a lot of questions to answer, and I'm not completely saying that every farmer is perfect, there's bad apples in every orchard, but there's a distinct feeling as I travel across Europe in particular, not just in Ireland, that farmers have been spoken down to, underappreciated, and maybe always not represented as well as they could by the bodies that are there. That there's, it's a very difficult job for people to do, to represent farmers, but I do think that in media, in politics, that farmers can be spoken down to, forgotten, and underappreciated. And if we look at the demographics and we look at actually one of the biggest challenges again around food production, it is actually having farmers to produce the food. And I think we need to realise that. So there's a couple of things I would do there. I think the recognition of food production not being easy. I think the really understanding and repositioning food and its importance role in our foods, in our planetary systems and in human health, and make it a really exciting industry, not just livestock production and cropping, but across all elements of agricultural production. And again, that's just an observation of mine. Again, if we look at farmer demographics in Ireland, it's no different. Our farming population is getting older, not a huge amount of succession. One of the other things that is often not talked about is that the generational element of farming. So this is an observation I have, that if I was a plumber or a mechanic and my great-grandfather was a plumber or mechanic, you don't always transfer that love of that profession down through generations. So I suppose we do need also to have the ability to bring in people from a non-agricultural background, allow them to come into the industry to produce food, to create and grow and profitable businesses. And I have to say, some of the best farmers I've ever worked with, farm managers I've ever worked with, are from a non-agricultural background. They're there for the passion, the love, they enjoy the process of it. And they often they probably have a more open mind and are unbiased by maybe previous generations. I'm not saying generational farming is bad, I'm just saying that there certainly is, you can't sustain a system where everyone just comes within that generational chain. We need to be able to bring new people and new thinking into agriculture and allow them to develop systems, and that's quite challenging, but we have to be thinking outside the box when we look at demographics. Now, technology, the answer to all our problems. One of the things that I looked at when I was traveling in my Nuffield was, well, where is the future of livestock production? Are we just going to have synthetic fermentation or synthetic biology taking over? And if I went back, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, I wouldn't have known as much about it, but I delved deeply into it, and I think there's been huge investment, there's been a lot of money spent. I could be completely wrong. If I put out this video, then there's I told you so moment, but from my observation on it, well, I think it will have a role to play. I'm just not sure that particularly synthetic biology is the future and the answer that we need. I think it will play a role. I think, again, it's a new market opportunity where capital and profit can be made. Is it the best for human health? I don't know. Currently, it's very, from a life cycle analysis point of view, very huge energy consumption. I think technology will play a role, in a positive role, in horticulture, livestock production and cropping. We're seeing that already, particularly if I suppose labour and workforce is going to be an issue and people are going to be an issue. Technology will play a role there. I think AI is going to be incredibly disruptive for all those of you who are using ChatGPT like me, just scratching the surface and the potential of AI. Technology, so to sum up technology, it will be a very interesting space. It moves at a pace that very few of us are able to comprehend, so often what I might say today will be irrelevant in 3 to 5 years. I think it will play a role in agricultural production and cropping systems and improving with efficiency. And I think it will have many positive benefits. So that's my theories on technology. So farming and human health, I think we must make this link. I think this is incredibly important. And I saw this statistic recently where 5% of gross domestic product was spent in 1960 in America on health. Now, in 2022, 20% of gross domestic product was spent on health. Our health budgets are increasing. Our health in developed countries is declining. And that is not sustainable. And if we think about human health and the impacts of it, you know, we for the first time in developed countries, we are looking at our lifespan being decreased. And I think there's a really important conversation around, we must move away from that lifespan metric on its own. We need to look at health span and people's health. If we don't act on this human metabolic health challenge that's occurring, that's very obviously occurring, well then we've real challenge. It's going to have an economic, so say social sustainability, and of course the consumption levels we're currently at are going to have impacts on planetary health. We really need to look at our food systems again, and this is just an observation, and we need to put value on it. People talk about food all the time, never cared as much but known as little. I think we need to put values on farmers. If we're using livestock or animals in our production, we need to value every one of those animals and understand that their consumption is a choice, has benefits, but we need to value those animals. We have to value our ecosystems we provide food in. We've got to value our supply chains, because without food there's chaos, particularly in a growing population. In a sometimes turbulent and unstable world, food supply is absolutely key. And everybody in the supply chain has a huge role to play. And I suppose I worked as a vet, I work as a consultant, and I meet people from nutritionists to, you know, when I go for my morning coffee, meeting the milkman, the bread man, to, you know, the people working in food shops. Everybody within the food supply chain needs to be valued. Can we continue with cheap food? It's a really interesting question. You know, food inflation, what impacts does that have, and what elements of society does that have? I think when we look at it, for me, again, this is my own bias, but we need to look at the link between soil health and human health. The soil that grows the food that maybe the animals consume, that we consume the animals, or the crops we consume directly, and looking at the impact on human health. I think the real exciting thing that I've learned, and you know, I want to see where it could be in 10 years' time, is when we understand the ecosystems of soil, the ecosystems of our plants, our animals that we consume, ourselves, they're intrinsically linked between the microbial life that's in them. And I think if we can get soil health right, we can start really creating a foundation for better health, human health, animal health, and overall planetary health. So, conclusions on health. Developed countries with significant challenges. Developing countries and developing nations, I think there's some unfortunate trends that they're emerging from developing nations, coming from mistakes we've made. But also, I don't want to pontificate to countries maybe that are developing, that have financial, ecosystem and climatary challenges that are different. And I think we need to do everything in our power to support agricultural systems, not just within our own developed nations, but in developing countries. Lessons we've learned, mistakes we've made. but also not trying to bring ideologies that are not relevant to countries who maybe depend on livestock production. I'm reminded of, you can't talk about the gut microbiome without talking about Hippocrates, the godfather of modern medicine. And he had that statement, "Let food be thy medicine." And that was 2000 BC that he said that. I'd probably add to that from what I've heard. I think let whole food be thy medicine. So real food be thy medicine would be my conclusion on health. Again, food production, planet and our ecosystems, we've seen an increase. I think there's a perception sometimes on agricultural land and food production. Again, I got this picture off the internet. Cropland the size of South America is probably our cropland. Livestock production the size of Africa when we think of land usage. But we've actually, what's often missed is we actually have efficiencies. The efficiencies we created through the Green Revolution have also saved a lot of forestry and ecosystems from destruction, because otherwise, if we didn't increase the efficiency within the acre, we would have had to produce more acres. So sometimes we forget that, but there's no doubt that food production is having a significant impact on our planet and ecosystems. Biodiversity loss. So this is the loss of nature, and it's complex. It's incredibly emotive, and if you're purely looking at food production from a biodiversity loss perspective, sometimes it can be, and maybe people are right, I don't know, a driver for policy change. But we have the issue of, if you focus on one area and don't understand that there's always trade-offs, you can get leakage and more devastating consequences. And I think this is something that may happen in Europe around food policy, where we're looking for, I suppose, a more sustainable and green future, but demand for food still is there, and we get this idea of leakage where food has to be produced somewhere else. So I think each continent, country needs to be very mindful of global food production, and I think this is relevant for Ireland in the debate around, and I think, look, middle sentence there, we absolutely need to do better, but we need to be incredibly careful about how we move forward, and we don't just move a problem somewhere else. We need to tackle it where it is, and not create challenges through leakage. Technology may have a role to play here. Policy is going to define the biodiversity loss story. There's no doubt we need to get better. We need to be mindful of our ecological and planetary systems, and sometimes we look at maybe the very obvious ecological damage we're doing around species, but if we actually understand the origin of species and how our ecosystems work, it actually comes back to the soil health story. If we can start getting soil health and nature right, I think there's a huge value there. So again, modern agriculture, undeniably, it's responsible for 25% of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Consumers have a big role to play here. And again, another Jack Bobo, I said it already, never cared more and known less. And there's no, I'm missing an N on the known, but so there's a real disconnect here. But this also, a trade-off, is in the realization, and I think this is sometimes given as an oversimplistic argument sometimes, that we have a growing population. So we're growing from 7 to 10 billion people in 2050. There is the need for trade-offs. But if we ignore the impacts on our natural world that modern agriculture is having, we're in dire straits. But if we look at maybe even food waste, and if we look at efficient systems in global agriculture, and as I traveled, I saw some incredible efficiencies. The adoption of technology and efficiencies that we currently have on farm, along with reduction of food waste, if we think of scaling that up to a global perspective, well, we've a lot of these challenges, and certainly the production quantity question is answered. But we just need to be mindful of our ecosystems in this as well. Again, water. The Colorado River, I was reading an article about the Colorado River, the longest river in America. Fresh water no longer flows to the sea. Fresh water is probably in the next 10, 20, 50 years going to be our most precious resource. We've got to be mindful of it, we've got to protect it, and I think in Ireland we won't have a lack of water, but we've got to be really, really conscious about our impact as humans, our agricultural production systems on water itself, the most precious resource on earth possibly. And then it comes to the environmental impact of livestock. As an observer, it's a very complicated and frustrating conversation and debate. We look at greenhouse gases, the huge story about methane, again, maybe a poor understanding. So life cycle analysis is a really important concept, that when we look at the production of milk, meat, I don't know, my biro that I have in my hand here, that we understand that it's from cradle to grave analysis. We understand looking at all the inputs. But when it comes to food, we need to look at life cycle analysis, but we also have to look at bioavailability and nutrient density. So when we look at particularly livestock and food and meat, as an example, it's always probably the most, has the heaviest environmental impact. But when you put nutrient density across it or on top of that, it levels it down a little bit. So it's a complex story that I'm not going to get into in massive detail here, but it's rarely understood. It's a massive frustration around livestock, and I think methane is often methane is a significant global warming gas, but if we look at biogenic methane, if we look at methane production from even rice, or particularly maybe production as a byproduct of oil production, it's a complex subject. I think if we look at the environmental impact of livestock as well, we've got to talk about animal welfare. And I think a lot of people will not consume meat because of their perceptions, and they're just uncomfortable about how livestock are farmed. And I think that's okay. I think people have every right to do that. I think the vast majority of people will consume meat, and we need to do a better job in understanding as well that how animals are produced, how we produce animals or how we treat animals to produce food. And also we need to get better at animal welfare. We need to make it a central part of how we produce livestock. And I think doing those things, we will reduce, actually, even on the animal welfare, the environmental impact. But there is trade-offs. Yes, of course, livestock production does have an impact. Cars, not cows. I think sometimes on both sides of the argument that methane can be oversimplified, the biogenic story, nothing to worry about. We do have to understand it's quite a huge warming potential. We don't, obviously, if you look at Miles Allen's work on GWP star, the rating, or how we actually look at it, understanding that it's a flow gas, that it's in a cyclical cycle, or it's in a cycle, particularly with herbivores, grass, and how we look at that biogenic cycle, but it still has significant warming potential. But I do feel sometimes it can be used by maybe overly emphasized, because fossil fuels, if we look at taking carbon from the ground and burning it for fossil fuels and using it for energy, well, there isn't always an equal comparison. This idea that less meat and we solve climate change, it's an oversimplistic argument. I think if you look at nutrient density, I think if you look at developing countries, I think, yes, we need to probably have less of everything perhaps. And what I find a little bit frustrating sometimes about the less meat argument is that we're consuming more of everything. We're a consumer-driven society, and okay, yeah, well, if we just eat a little bit less meat, that'll be okay. I don't think necessarily that's the answer. It's the less of everything. And again, if we look at warming potential of gases, we look at carbon dioxide, we look at methane as a 32. You know, sometimes every time I read it's a different figure, but so 32 times the warming potential of CO2. Nitrous oxide, and we look at fertilizer use, that's a huge one. It's over 200 times the warming potential of CO2. But definitely, I think there can be an emphasis on cows. I think we need to be more efficient, certainly. We can see massive increases in global herd numbers, because that does lead to increases in methane in the short term, which can have devastating consequences. We do need to looking at plateauing or mild reductions or mitigation of methane, but it's a complex subject and rarely fully understood. And because of sound bites and time, it's rarely given the time and the depth that it needs. Again, these are some, I was listening to a presentation and looking at the differences between CO2 from energy, looking at methane as a cyclical gas, looking at it as a flow gas, understanding the capacity of maybe grazing systems as well. I think this has been really captured in the regenerative idea of livestock's role and herbage taking CO2 into soil, that nutrient recycling, that synergistic system. I think it's complex, but we do need to focus a little bit more on fossil fuels. Cows have a role to play, but if we don't have a deep understanding of it, we are going to shape policy poorly. Nitrogen, again, if we look at nitrous oxide, we wouldn't be where we are without nitrogen fertilizers. There's a lot of people saying that we should just remove synthetic chemicals and fertilizers. I think they actually have a role to play. I think we need a weaning process. I think we need to understand soil biology. We need to use them better. Not always spoken about maybe in the climate debate. It's always cows and methane, fossil fuels, but nitrogen fertilizers have a role to play as well. But we wouldn't be here without synthetic fertilizer. So that's really important to understand. You just don't turn off this switch. But from my learning, again, maybe it's my bias, is looking at biologicals and their role, looking at grasses and plants and their ability to fix nitrogen. I think there's some really exciting things happening in that space. Just a little bit on biology and welfare. Again, understanding the cow. This is my nutfield. So this is a really simple concept I came up with, is really understand the cow. It actually really works. Building better systems for the dairy cow and how that can improve her life, her welfare, her production, her ability to produce food. So I'm coming at this from the angle of food production and efficiency, mindful of welfare, but by actually looking at optimizing her biology and welfare, you actually improve things. Again, I do an awful lot of work with calves. Again, here, after traveling the world and looking at calves, here are some of my top tips: more colostrum, more milk, more straw. It's about biological optimization of behavior. And for me, from a welfare perspective, this is something that often frustrates me is, I do a lot of work and have done a lot of work in the dairy industry. The consumer's biggest concern from a welfare perspective is cow-calf separation. When you actually get on farm, from a calf perspective, that's a tiny concern. Practically, I'm not saying it's not an issue, but it's practically, there's way more important things we need to do within the livestock production system. And there's often that disconnect from the consumer and what actually happens in the production system, and really understanding what the welfare challenges are. Like every element of agriculture, life and business and our planet and politics, we can do better. But we've made a lot of advancements there that are sometimes forgotten. Regenerative agriculture. You'd have to be quite excited by it. I think it's practiced, maybe an art, not yet truly peer-reviewed, and I would like to put it in the public domain that I think this is an exciting area. I think it makes a lot of sense. I love that idea of soil to society. That if we can get soil health right, we can get a lot of things right. Very unpopular opinion, but monocultures have significant challenges. Particularly, all you've got to do is take a shovel with you out to monocultures, to fields, to look at soil biology, worm counts, and see that, okay, they're very efficient, but what are they doing to soil? And that comes not just to from an animal perspective, but also if we want to go to this plant-based future where we're going to produce monocultures at scale, I don't think that's necessarily the right thing to do. It's about understanding our ecosystems. With Precision Microbes, we're nature working with nature, and regenerative agriculture maybe has a lot of ties with that. I think it's interesting that it's practitioners who are using it and has not been backed up by science yet, but I think in the next 10 years, if we don't adopt some of the principles and understanding and ideas from regenerative agriculture, along with technology, along with chemistry and chemicals that we will still need them, I think we're going to be in big trouble. And again, my interest in regenerative agriculture came from very practical issues I've seen as a farm vet. If anybody's still listening, I've gone over an hour. I've seen these issues like summer scar syndrome, cows eating stones, massive issues with milk drop, SARA, all these challenges I've seen with parasites increasing. And very, very obvious to me when you actually look and you see what is potential. Again, it's if we look at ultra processed foods, if we look at we've got really good at growing monocultures, it creates challenges, and that's the trade-off of efficiencies that I'm talking about maybe throughout this. And as a centrist, again, just looking and saying, well, it's not about knocking really monocultures. We've achieved a lot, but what's the shift we need to make? This is an amazing subject. So if we look at a teaspoon of soil has as many microorganisms as there is people on the planet. So the living life in soil, if we fail to understand this, and if we don't start working with soil, I think it's huge. So I do a lot of farmer talks, and if you want to distill down information, over an hour in, you think that's not distilling information, but I will say to farmers 2 things to focus on: soil health and mindset, because soil health is going to be everything over the next decade and beyond, and mindset, because we're at a time of unprecedented change. Having the ability to adapt, learn and grow in an environment is going to be key attribute for people. Again, I think ruminants have a huge role to play in soil biology, in grazing systems. I've been reading a lot of Alan Savory's work again recently. Very interesting guy. He's often talked about because of his very famous TED talk. It's a very emotional talk. It's a very real talk. But I think his recent work as well, it's hard to deny, around soil biology, around the challenges of desertification, the role that ruminant livestock have in mimicking maybe herbivores of old grazing behaviors, and how we can bring life and produce food in those cyclical systems. And I think really important in developing countries, but important principles for us to understand as well in modern agricultural systems, that there may need to be an adaptation there in how we do things. But if we ignore soil biology, we're in so much trouble. Biodiversity. So yeah, biodiversity loss starts in soil. So if we look at the hierarchy of feeding for our wildlife, diversity of plants, the role that plants play in root length and soil microbiome, diversity of worms, and ruminants are part of this ecological system. And I think this is a really exciting, maybe it's a vision idea for farming, where we can begin to understand that. We can build soil organic matter, help biodiversity with proper grazing management. And if we think about carbon capture, sometimes again oversimplified by people, if we look at trees versus herbage and grazing ruminants, we look at actually the ability to retain carbon within soil. Herbage and ruminants in a short term are far, far better, again, from what I've read. So biodiversity starts at soil level. Again, I love this pyramid. I got it off the internet. And it's, if we think about 8 billion microorganisms in a teaspoon of soil, and we think about the ecosystem and the food chain and the pyramid that's involved in some of the more visual animals, the worm is a good indicator species if we look at that kind of that hierarchy. But if we look at how our food's produced, wildlife within our ecosystems, that if we ignore the base of the house of cards, the pyramid, whatever it is, everything else collapses. And that's what species loss is about. And this is the challenge for agriculture as we move forward, that we look at how our agricultural systems are built, and that actually the exciting thing is that soil health can be linked to the ecosystem, to the food health, to the food we produce, to human health. Maybe it's idealistic, I don't know, but to me it's a passion, an area of interest, driven by what I've learned working with Precision Microbes around the future of food and animal health and human health. Again, as a grazing country, we spend a lot of time talking about pasture, the kilos of dry matter that we grow, but why does the plant exude 25% of its energy through the root? What's that energy look like? Look at understanding carbon sequestration, look at the photosynthesis, look at the life cycle of our plants and their ecosystems, the retention of water, understanding the importance of diversity of plants and crops we produce for our animals, plants and crops we produce for ourselves. It's again the worm here in this ecosystem, in this pyramid, how important that worm is within an ecosystem. Soil, not pasture. We need to focus on understanding what's happening more underneath the ground. We look at species like dung beetles, indicator species again that are in decline. Again, how we can harness this better understanding of ecosystems for more productive animals production systems, but also the benefits of on the challenges we see around biodiversity. I think it's really exciting. We should all be picking up soil health books and starting to read about them. Read about it. Again, this is I was lucky to visit just a kind of a practical example of smart swords. I spent time with Tommy Boland a morning probably 12 months ago now, looking at animal performance through multi-species grazing, looking at the reduction of days to slaughter, reduction in dosing for wormers and anthelmintics. Soil biology, a twofold increase in worms per hectare if we look at worms as an indicator species. Water quality, I think it's since been confirmed, but really positive indicators as well. If we look at diversity of root lengths in plants and how water retention and soil microbiome, the soil's ability to retain water, reduction in nitrogen. We often focus on fossil fuels, we talk about cows and methane, but nitrogen is a significant impact on climate change. It's got a high warming potential. It's utilized in both crop and animal production. So this is sometimes I forget when we talk about a plant-based future, how are we going to produce all these plants? Are we going to use chemical fertilizers? Is it going to be monoculture structure? So it's again about understanding the whole system. Massive reductions in nitrogen. Drought resistance. You know, the horse has bolted when it comes to climate change. I'm one of those people who thinks we've done a bit of damage. It's about damage limitation now, and I don't think that's anything. That's just the way it is. So droughts are going to be more of a challenge. So drought resistance. It makes sense that we need to look at all these challenges. There is a challenge around persistency issues, but this, for me, projects like this, looking at the role of plants and in soil microbiome is really exciting. Must visit is UCD Research Centre. So it could be my biases, but I've tried to have an open mind. I've tried to learn. Again, soil health, animal health, planetary health, human health, it can all be linked. It's microbial. So I am really lucky to be working in this space where working with a company that's innovating around microbes and soil, plants, animals, humans eventually. But it's about really understanding how our ecosystems work. The more we understand, the better and more efficient our systems will be. As we scale up food production through maybe the needs through population and supply, there's always trade-offs. But if we ignore biology completely, if we ignore biological optimization and behavior of animals, plants, we are in, and ourselves, for big challenges. I think it's going to be really important that we look at education and food as well. Again, if we look at the vegan water, these claims around food, should education and food be a primary school subject at the moment? And we need to really look at how we're going to affect behavior change. And again, the consumer never cared as much and known as little. And I'm not trying to knock people, but you know, sound bites on food. If you go onto social media, you know, you pull what hair you have out. But we really need to understand a basic understanding of food and education and health, because all the indicators are there that if we don't, we are going to have massive problems. So start with the end in mind. Why do we produce food? It is from a human health perspective, and we think we need to get back to that. Again, I had a picture of Trump, a quote from Winston Churchill. I think this is your classic modern day PowerPoint. But the further backward you can look, the further forward you're likely to see. We've seen that trends in political history. We can see that trends around maybe evolutionary medicine and biology. I think that's a really interesting subject. If we look back to our basic human behaviors and needs, and what we eat and what impact it can have. We, of course, have had massive technological and medical advancements, but we have also have challenges from overabundance. And when we look at chronic disease, we've got to look at the root causes. And I think we've got to ask ourselves hard questions. We're at another inflection point in agriculture right now. We did it before with the Green Revolution. I think we're at a time for inflection point. And again, Again, there's so much potential with technology. If we look at functional foods, I've done a lot of work reading about diet and gut health in humans at the moment. And there's some really exciting stuff happening. And again, I think the more we look at food and health, the better the future of food will be. I would like to say the future of food and farming and human health. I'm reading a lot of Gabrielle Lyon's work. She's a geriatric specialist looking at muscle and protein and animal protein. And I think animal protein is an incredibly important macronutrient. I've read all the papers, I've listened to hundreds of podcasts on the subject from all sorts of experts. And back to basics, I think it's an important nutrient for young people, for skeletal development and immunological development. I think for older people, as an aging population, if we look at lifespan and overlap health span with it, and sarcopenia and muscle loss, I think it's a really important nutrient. So animal proteins are nutrient dense. We need to be very mindful of how we produce livestock, and being mindful of animal welfare and all the challenges around our ecosystem. But for me, after much thinking time, I think I would be very worried if I didn't have access to animal protein from a health perspective and nutrition perspective, not just for myself, but for my kids and my family as well. So the future of food, communication. It often comes back to this. We can talk about science, and I like reading about science, but it's all about perceptions. And the challenge is that maybe social media has democratized opinions, and it can be very challenging. There's all sorts of documentaries about food. I love Kiss the Ground, actually, Woody Harrelson's one on soil. There's the Game Changers on a vegan diet. It's not about science, it's about perceptions. I often think, I do a lot of work in the UK, and I talk to farmers over there, and they're all, vast majority, really love Clarkson's farming because it brought a perspective of the realness of agriculture. Now, he can be a very divisive character, Jeremy Clarkson, but it was interesting to observe that program and how it told a story about farming that was real, not overly romantic, and how impactful that was. So in a world where communication can be fact or fake, it can be very difficult, it can be about perceptions. So the future of food will depend on the stories we tell and who's telling them. If it continues around particularly ultra-processed food, if we don't take control of that story and limit maybe the marketing power of some of the companies behind ultra-processed food, we're in real big trouble. I think sometimes when it comes to social media and food, we kind of listen to a loud, angry, vocal minority and forget that there's a silent, happy minority who, particularly when we think about food, who are reasonable. We need to take a centrist approach. If we don't understand how we communicate about food, the science is irrelevant, because it will be about perceptions, and that will be the biggest challenge. And it's about balance. Everything comes back to balance, and that's why I tried to put this presentation together as a centrist. Would a vet have a role? If anybody's still listening, I think absolutely. Optimizing biology and farming systems work, holistic farm system approach. But I suppose I believe that the challenges queue is long, the solutions queue is short. And you can put vets, you can put farmers, you can put nutritionists, you can put anybody in the food supply chain here. It's about solutions. And it's a journey. Sure, what presentation could you do now without talking about journeys? But it's a slow change. But ultimately, we're trying to me, we're going to have to fix chronic disease in humans. Chronic disease is now a challenge. And maybe in soil, we need to look at soil and how we're managing it. We actually still need chemistry. We still need chemicals. We need technology. We actually need all the tools available to us. The future is exciting. But ultimately, I suppose I work in the carrot space, incentives of an idea. Precision Microbes, we're in the disruption space. We're bringing new ideas, and it's probably the most exciting ideas I've ever come across in my life. But ultimately, it'll be legislation and policy that will determine the future. And I think if we don't have people in the centre with common sense, with a very good understanding of the system and a long-term view of food production, we could be in trouble. We don't want to make snap decisions. But food policies will shape the future of food, and I hope that they take into account why we produce food. Don't take the food producers for granted, and understand that there's some powerful influences at play, of course, but balanced approaches to the future of food benefits the food we eat, the people, and our planet. Thanks for listening.